Aston Martin was supposed to arrive in 2026 looking ready to fight at the front, but 2 races into the season, the whole project already feels unstable. This team came in with Adrian Newey, a new factory, Honda power, and massive expectations. Instead of momentum, they have 0 points, 2 double retirements, and a car that cannot even make it to the finish. That is the shock. The team built to look dangerous now looks vulnerable, and the biggest reason is not what most people expected. Fernando Alonso is the name that brings the whole story into focus because this is no longer just about speed. In China, Alonso retired on lap 32 after saying the vibrations were worse than anything the team had felt that weekend. Lance Stroll was out even earlier, after 9 laps, with another problem tied to the same weakness. So this was not a normal bad start. Aston Martin was not chasing performance gains. They were trying to survive their own machine, and that changes everything around the team. Now the pressure is moving away from the car and straight into the leadership room. Newey stepping back is not just a headline, it is a warning that Aston Martin has a deeper problem than race pace alone. A team with this much money, this much talent, and this much ambition should not look this fragile so early. And before we talk about who leads this team next, we need to look at the car that started this whole mess. Aston Martin's first real collapse began before the leadership drama became public, because the AMR26 was already showing signs that something was badly wrong. The team came into Melbourne with the fewest testing kilometers on the grid, which meant they were entering race weekend with less understanding and less margin for error than their rivals. That matters because when a new project starts from a weak base, every session becomes damage control instead of proper development. The biggest issue was the Honda power unit vibration. This was not a small balance problem or a minor setup struggle. The oscillations were strong enough to damage the battery systems and severe enough to affect the drivers physically over a race distance. Alonso's retirement in China and Stroll's early exit made it clear this was a full team problem, not one isolated failure. A car like that does not let engineers chase lap time because the first target becomes simple survival. That is where the entire story changed shape. Aston Martin was not operating like a team searching for extra pace. They were operating like a team trying to stop the whole package from breaking apart on Sunday. And once the car became that unstable, the pressure on everyone above it became impossible to hide, which is why the Newey question gets even bigger from here. Adrian Newey was always the biggest symbol of Aston Martin's future, but that did not mean he was the right person to carry the team through an early season crisis from the pit wall. His value has always come from shaping winning cars, setting technical direction, and seeing performance problems before anyone else does. That is very different from running the daily pressure of a Formula 1 team when the results start going wrong and the whole structure needs calm control. That is why his move into the team principal role always felt temporary. It looked more like a short-term fix than a real long-term plan. A team principal has to manage people, pressure, decisions, and internal order while the whole operation is under stress. Newey's strength is building the machine itself. Putting him in charge of the wider crisis risked pulling him away from the area where Aston Martin needs him most, and that made the arrangement feel unstable from the start. Once the car problems became impossible to hide, that role mismatch stood out even more. Aston Martin did not just need technical brilliance at that point, they needed someone whose main job was to control the response around it. Newey stepping back makes sense for that reason, but it also opens a much bigger question. If he was never meant to stay in that role, then the next issue becomes who Aston Martin wanted in that seat. And why the most obvious name is already off the table. Christian Horner looked like the one name who could bring instant authority to this situation because he has already lived through championship pressure, internal politics, and the demands of leading a top Formula 1 team. On the surface, the fit made sense. He knew Newey, he understood how winning structures operate, and he had the kind of experience Aston Martin suddenly needed. That is why his name felt so important the moment Newey's position started to look temporary. But this story did not turn on reputation alone. The real problem was the history between Horner and Newey. Their past success at Red Bull made the idea attractive, yet their later tension made it far more complicated than it looked from the outside. But Aston Martin could not simply choose the strongest available profile if the person guiding the technical future was not open to rebuilding that partnership. That changed the balance of power inside the search immediately. So Horner was not pushed aside because he lacked status or experience. He became difficult because Aston Martin's leadership problem is tied tied directly to its technical dependence on Newey. That is what makes this more serious than a normal hiring decision. The team did not just lose an option, it revealed how narrow its real options may be, and that takes the search straight to the next layer: who is left, and why they now hold more leverage than Aston Martin does. With Horner no longer looking like the solution, Aston Martin is left studying names that make sense on paper, but come with their own risks. And Jonathan Wheatley stands out because he understands how a winning team actually functions behind the scenes, not just on race day, but in the constant flow of decisions that shape a season. That kind of experience matters now because Aston Martin does not need a symbolic figure. It needs someone who can bring order to a project that has started drifting at exactly the wrong time. The problem is that someone like Wheatley is not walking into this from a weak position. He already has a serious role at Audi, and that changes the entire balance of the conversation. Aston Martin cannot just offer a famous title and expect that to be enough. Any credible candidate will look at the unstable car, the public leadership shift, and the pressure coming from every direction, then ask a simple question: how much real control comes with this job? And how much chaos comes with it too? That is why the search now feels more dangerous for Aston Martin than it first appeared. The team is not choosing freely from a perfect list. It is trying to convince experienced people to step into one of the hardest situations on the grid. And once that becomes the reality, the focus naturally moves to the person every serious candidate will study before saying yes: Lawrence Stroll. Lawrence Stroll built Aston Martin into one of the most ambitious projects in Formula One, but ambition alone does not solve a crisis when the structure at the top starts to look unclear. At this point, any serious team principal candidate will not just study the car, the results, or the pressure from the paddock. They will study Stroll himself. They will want to know how much freedom this role really has, how much authority comes with it, and whether the person walking in can actually run the team when the pressure gets worse. That is where the recent pattern starts to matter. Andy Cowell was moved aside. Newey is stepping back. The leadership picture keeps changing while the car problems are still active, and that makes the whole operation feel unsettled. For Aston Martin, this is no longer just about finding a respected name. It is about proving that the next leader will be allowed to make hard decisions, hold control, and bring stability without constant uncertainty hanging over every move. If that answer stays unclear, then even the best candidate may hesitate, and that would leave Aston Martin in an even weaker position heading deeper into the season. A fast team can survive a bad weekend. A rich team can survive a slow start. But a team with open questions around authority, direction, and trust becomes much harder to fix. And that is why the next part of this story is so important, because the calendar is about to give Aston Martin one short window to stop this from getting worse. Aston Martin now has one stretch of time that matters more than any press statement or leadership rumor: the gap between Japan and Miami. This is the window where Honda has to attack the root of the vibration problem and give the team something usable before the season slips even further away. Right now, the issue is not something a clever setup change can hide for one weekend. It needs real engineering work, and that means Aston Martin is racing the clock as much as it is racing the grid. That puts even more pressure on Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll, because the team cannot simply ask them to keep pushing through the same weakness forever. Driver trust matters in moments like this. If the car keeps shaking, braking, and cutting races short, the damage is not only on the results sheet, it affects confidence, rhythm, and the whole feeling inside the garage. So this next phase is about more than new parts. It is about whether Aston Martin can show the drivers and the paddock that the project is still under control. If Miami arrives and the same problems are still there, then this story stops looking like an ugly early season phase and starts looking like something much more serious. That is why the final question now becomes impossible to avoid. Is Aston Martin still dealing with one bad opening chapter or are we watching the first real sign that the entire project has been built in the wrong order? Aston Martin's problem is no longer just a bad car or a messy start. It now looks like a project where the mechanical weakness and the leadership weakness surfaced at the same time. And that is why this story feels so heavy. The team still has money, facilities, big names, and one of the sharpest technical minds the sport has ever seen. But none of that protects you if the machine cannot finish races, and the structure above it is still searching for clarity while the season is already moving on. That is what makes this moment so important. important. Newey stepping back may be the correct move, yet it also confirms that Aston Martin is still trying to put the right people in the right places after the pressure has already exploded. Horner is not the easy answer. The next candidates will ask hard questions. Honda must now deliver real progress. Alonso and Lance Stroll need a car they can trust. Every part of the project is now being tested at once, and that is a brutal place for any team to be. So the real danger for Aston Martin is not just losing points early, it is allowing this opening crisis to define the image of the entire 2026 campaign before the recovery even begins. If the fixes come fast, this story becomes a painful warning that the team survived. If they do not, then this season may be remembered as the point where Aston Martin's grand plan stopped looking like the future and started looking like a project under strain.